I could make this one of those dramatic psychology videos. You know the type. Dark tone, slow voice, a few smart words, dopamine, reward system, cognitive distortion, variable reinforcement. Then a thumbnail that basically screams, "The casino is controlling your brain." Very cinematic. Also very lazy. Because if we talk about guilt and shame in gambling like they're just scary science words, we miss the part that actually matters. What it feels like from the inside. And more importantly, why those feelings don't always stop the behavior. Because that's the confusing part, right? If gambling makes people feel so bad, why do they go back? That question matters way more than pretending this is just about weak willpower or bad decisions. So let's do this properly. The biggest mistake people make with this topic is thinking guilt and shame show up at the end. As if the story goes like this. First, there's fun, then maybe a win, then a loss. Then guilt walks in like some moral police officer, writes a ticket, and the whole thing is over. Clean, simple. Completely wrong. Guilt and shame are not just the ending. They're part of the machine. They don't only happen after the damage. Sometimes they help keep the cycle going. And that sounds strange until you look at what gambling actually does emotionally. On the surface, this is a video about guilt and shame. That's the obvious problem. But there's a deeper problem under it. And I'm not going to fully reveal it yet. Just keep it in the back of your mind. Because by the end, you'll see that the worst thing gambling takes from a person is not always the money. Sometimes it's something even more private than that. Now, when people picture gambling, they usually picture the loud part. The lights, the spinning reels, the big reaction after a win, the false confidence, the "this could be it" face. Nobody pictures the quiet part. Nobody imagines the tab being closed too fast. The bank app opened, then closed, then opened again. The message you don't reply to. The tiny moment where you realize you're hiding something, even if nobody has asked you a single question yet. That matters, because if your first image of gambling is wrong, your whole understanding of it will be wrong too. This topic is not really for the person who just wants to feel morally superior and say, "Well, I would simply stop." Congratulations, very useful contribution. This is for the person who wants to understand why someone keeps going, even while feeling awful. It's for the person who has felt that awful mix of hope and dread and doesn't quite know how both can exist at the same time. And it's for the person who maybe isn't listening to learn something new. Maybe they're listening because this feels uncomfortably familiar. So let's trace the actual emotional route, not the movie version, the real one. It usually starts with anticipation. That's the first trap. Not the loss, not even the win, the anticipation. That small wave of possibility. Maybe this time. Maybe this spin. Maybe this hand. Maybe this bet changes the mood, the night, the balance, the story. And what makes this powerful is that the brain often reacts strongly to the expectation of reward, not just the reward itself. In plain English, the maybe can feel incredible, sometimes more incredible than the result. That's why someone can get pulled in even without winning very much, because the emotional charge is already there before anything good actually happens. Then comes the spike. The bet is placed, the wheel spins, the cards flip, the game starts moving, and suddenly attention narrows. The outside world gets blurry. Your pulse picks up. Your mind stops being broad and becomes incredibly small. Not deep, small, focused on one tiny outcome. This is important because people often call that feeling excitement. And sometimes it is. But excitement is not the whole story. There's tension in it too. Pressure, urgency, a weird private intensity. Like your whole body has agreed, for a few seconds, that this one meaningless moment is the most important thing in the universe. And if there's a win, especially early on, that changes everything. Now the brain gets to tell a very dangerous story. Maybe I get this. Maybe I understand this. Maybe I'm good at this. Maybe I can feel the pattern. Even when the game is mostly random, the emotional brain loves turning randomness into a personal talent. That's how illusion starts. Not with stupidity, with pattern seeking, with meaning making, with the brain doing what it always does, trying to turn chaos into something it can hold. And when that illusion lands on top of a win, even a small one, it feels convincing. Not because it's true, because it feels earned. Then comes the loss. And here's where a lot of people misunderstand what happens next. The loss is not just disappointment. It's often insult. It feels offensive, unfair, almost personal, especially after a near miss. That result where the brain says, "See, you were close. That means something." But it usually means almost nothing. That's the cruelty of it. Almost feels like evidence, as if being close means being next, as if the game owes you a correction, as if probability has memory and fairness has a schedule. It doesn't, but in the moment, it feels like it does. And that feeling matters more than logic when the nervous system is already lit up. This is where frustration enters. Not quiet disappointment, frustration. The kind that says, no, 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 that was supposed to go differently. And once frustration shows up, the purpose of gambling begins to shift. This is the turning point. At first, the person may be playing for pleasure, or curiosity, or excitement, or the fantasy of winning. But after enough emotional charge, especially after losses, the motive changes. Now they may be playing to remove a feeling, to get rid of the tension, to undo the irritation, to cancel the sting of what just happened. That is a huge shift. Because once gambling becomes a way to escape discomfort, it stops being about fun. Now it's medicine. Bad medicine. Expensive medicine. Medicine that causes the wound and then sells itself as the cure. And if the person keeps going, anxiety starts to build. This is where the fun image really collapses, because now there's money in it, time in it, a growing internal sense that this is slipping. The thoughts start changing. Not, what if I win? Now it becomes, how much have I spent? How do I explain this? Should I stop now? What if I stop right before it turns around? That last one is brutal, because it sounds rational for about half a second, and then it quietly keeps people trapped for hours. Now guilt begins to take shape, and guilt is specific. Guilt says, I did something I shouldn't have done. I spent too much. I lied. I stayed longer than I planned. I used money I said I wouldn't touch. Guilt is painful, but guilt still has structure. It still points to actions. And because it points to actions, guilt can, in theory, lead to repair. You can admit it. You can stop. You can apologize. You can make a different choice. But shame is different. Shame is heavier, more personal, less organized. Shame does not say, I did something bad. Shame says, what is wrong with me? That's a completely different experience, because now the problem is no longer the action. Now the problem feels like the self. Not, I made a bad decision. I am the kind of person who does this. Not, I crossed a line. I am weak. I am pathetic. I can't be trusted. That's why shame is so dangerous. Guilt can push a person toward honesty. Shame usually pushes them toward hiding. And hiding is where the cycle gets darker. Because once shame enters, secrecy often grows with it. The browser history gets cleared. The receipts disappear. The amount gets minimized. the timeline gets edited. The story changes.
Not that much. Just once. I almost won it back.
It's under control. And maybe the saddest part is that sometimes the person is not only lying to other people, they are editing the story for themselves. Not because they're evil, because shame makes direct eye contact with reality feel unbearable. That's why shame doesn't just sit there like a consequence. It changes behavior. It makes the person more secretive, more isolated, more split. There's the outside version of them, and then there's the hidden version managing panic in silence. Now here's the question that makes this whole thing more disturbing. If shame feels so awful, why doesn't it end the behavior immediately? Wouldn't you think humiliation would kill the urge? Sometimes it does, but sometimes it does the opposite. Because if the next bet carries even a tiny chance of relief, then the bet starts to feel like an escape from shame itself. Think about that. A person feels bad because they gambled, so they gamble again to stop feeling bad. Not forever, just for a moment. Just enough to breathe. Just enough to feel possibility instead of disgust. Just enough to replace "what have I done" with "maybe I can fix this." That is how guilt and shame get wired into the cycle instead of standing outside it. And random rewards make this worse, because the occasional win doesn't solve the problem. It interrupts the pain. For a few minutes, maybe longer, the person feels restored. Not healed, restored. As if the shame has been postponed. As if the story can still be rewritten. As if one win can erase 10 bad decisions and the version of you who made them. Of course, it usually can't. But emotionally, it can feel like forgiveness. That's why random rewards are so powerful. Not because they always pay, because they arrive unpredictably. An unpredictable relief is one of the strongest ways to keep a behavior alive. The brain keeps leaning in. Maybe now. Maybe this time.
Maybe the next one turns the whole thing around.
And this is where we come back to the deeper problem I mentioned earlier. The deeper problem is not just that the person wants money back. That's only the visible layer. What they often want back is themselves. The version of themselves from before the spiral started. The version that felt decent, in control, clean, untouched. That's why gambling after a loss can become so emotionally intense. The person is not only chasing cash, they're chasing restoration. They want one outcome that lets them say, "See, I'm not stupid. I'm not out of control. I'm not that person." But the more they chase that feeling through gambling, the further they move from it. That's the trap. The tool they're using to repair their identity is the same tool that keeps damaging it. And that creates one of the ugliest emotional loops in the whole experience. A person feels shame. They gamble to escape shame. The gambling creates more shame. So they need more escape. Round and round. Not glamorous, not exciting, just exhausting. At some point, the emotional high is barely even the point anymore. That's important to understand. From the outside, people often assume the gambler is chasing pleasure. And sometimes, early on, yes. But later, a lot of the time they're chasing relief. Temporary relief. Narrow relief. The kind that doesn't solve anything, but makes the next 5 minutes survivable. And once a behavior becomes a relief button, logic gets weaker. Because now stopping doesn't just mean giving up the chance to win. It means facing the full emotional bill all at once. The money, the lying, the fear, the self-disgust, the silence. That's a heavy moment, which is why so many people delay it. Now, I know there's a very efficient, very cold way to end a video like this. Just say gambling causes shame, shame causes secrecy, secrecy causes more gambling. Done. Neat little summary. Sounds smart. Feels complete. But it leaves out the most human part. The person inside the loop usually still hates what's happening. They usually still know something is wrong. The presence of shame is not proof that they don't care. Sometimes it's proof they care deeply and have no good way to stop the spiral alone. That matters. Because the way out of guilt and shame is not more humiliation. It's not harsher self-hatred. And it's definitely not pretending the feelings aren't there. The way out starts when the secret stops being protected. Because shame grows in darkness. It survives through isolation, through edited stories, through private bargains, through one last time. The moment a person says the real number out loud, the real loss, the real behavior, the real fear, shame loses some of its magic. Not all of it, but some. Because now it is no longer this shapeless monster hiding behind the eyes. Now it has language. And once something has language, it can be faced. That doesn't make the consequences disappear. It doesn't refund the money. It doesn't rewind the damage. But it breaks the strange spell where secrecy feels safer than truth. And that's important because guilt and shame are not identical. Guilt can actually become useful when it stays honest. Guilt can say, this has to change. Shame says, hide. Guilt says, repair. Shame says, disappear. One emotion can point toward responsibility. The other tries to erase the person entirely. So if you understand nothing else from this, understand this. In gambling, guilt hurts because of what happened. Shame hurts because of what it starts to mean about who you are. And when those two mix with hope, adrenaline, losses, random rewards, and the fantasy of fixing everything with one more try, they stop acting like brakes. They become part of the engine. That is why this topic is so serious. And that is why reducing it to just stop misses almost everything. Because the person is not simply fighting temptation. They may be fighting the urge to run from their own reflection. And gambling, for a while, can feel like a way not to look. But only for a while. Then the screen goes dark. The account balance is still there. The silence is still there. And the person is still there too. Which is actually the most important part. Because shame always tries to convince people that they are the problem. Not the pattern, not the loop, not the behavior. Them. And that lie is dangerous. The behavior can be destructive. The consequences can be serious. The denial can be ugly. But the person is still more than the worst loop they got trapped in. If they weren't, shame wouldn't hurt in the first place. So no, guilt and shame in gambling are not side effects. They are central. They are part of the emotional architecture of the cycle. But they are also signals. Proof that something inside the person is still resisting the lie that this is normal, harmless, or who they truly are. And maybe that's the most uncomfortable truth here. The pain is not useless. It's telling the truth long before the person is ready to say it out loud. The real danger is not feeling guilt. The real danger is trying to silence it with the very thing that created it. That's when the loop closes. And that's why the first real break in the cycle is usually not a win. It's honesty.